Senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Mr. President, 1 out of 4 women in this country have been a victim of sexual assault. This is an epidemic, and it tells me, and I think the vast majority of the American people, that we need a culture change in the way boys and men respond to women. Last night, President of the United States, instead of understanding that we have to change our culture, instead of understanding that we have got to make it easier for women who have been victims of sexual assault to come forward and tell their stories, got up on a podium in Mississippi and mocked Dr. Ford, made fun of her. Here is a woman who has come forward to do what she thought was right as an American citizen, understanding from day one that she would be attacked by political opponents. And the result of her having come forward was that she has received death threats. She's been separated from her children. She's had Nazis protesting outside her house. That's what she has gone through. And the president's response to her courage is to mock her, to make fun of her. Now, what kind of message does that send to women and men all over this country, women who are struggling to determine whether, when they come forward, they will be laughed at, they will be rejected? The President of the United States should lead this country in changing that type of culture, making it easier for women to come forward and tell their stories, making it clear to boys and men that in this country that type of behavior is unacceptable. And yet we had a leader of our country, a president of the United States, mocking this woman. And I would hope that every member of this chamber, regardless of your feelings about Kavanaugh, come forward and express disgust and outrage at the behavior of President Trump with regard to Dr. Ford. Mr. President, a number of my Republican colleagues have come forward and they said, you know, at the very beginning of this process, well before the allegations of sexual assault or the veracity of Mr. Kavanaugh, there were people who were coming forward saying they were opposed to the nomination. I plead guilty. I was one of those people. And I announced my opposition to Judge Kavanaugh probably a day after Trump made that nomination. And let me tell you exactly why I came out early against Judge Kavanaugh. And the reason is that for years now, there has been a hard right 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court who have time and time again made rulings that represented the wealthy and the powerful, rulings against the interests of working families, women, the environment, children, and the poor. And based on the statements that Kavanaugh had made over the years, and based on his judicial rulings, I had no doubt that if seated, Kavanaugh would become part of that hard right majority. And I should tell you now, based on the last hearing that took place before the Judiciary Committee, where we saw Mr. Kavanaugh's politics come right out, my initial judgment turned out to be exactly right. If he is seated, he will be part of a hard right. a hard right that ruled on Citizens United, that billionaires in America have the right to undermine our democracy and spend as much money as they want to electing candidates who represent the wealthy and the powerful. And I fear that if Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court, he will take Citizens United even further. We have a hard right on the Supreme Court by a 5-4 vote that gutted the Voting Rights Act, an act designed to protect minorities from discrimination in terms of their ability to vote. And literally the day after that decision came down, you had Republican governors and attorneys general all over this country working overtime, shamefully, cowardly, to make it harder for poor people, people of color, young people to vote. And I have no doubt that if Mr. Kavanaugh is seated, he will be part of that hard right philosophy. So I apologize to nobody for, within one day of that nomination, saying that I was opposed to it. Now, that's my view. Obviously, many of my Republican colleagues, maybe some Democrats, did not reach that conclusion. However, in the past 3 months, and especially in the past few weeks, we have heard credible accusations of sexual assault by several women. These are charges that must be thoroughly and seriously investigated by the FBI. Now, if confirmed, Judge Kavanaugh will have a lifetime seat on the Supreme Court, a lifetime seat. And yet we have the Republican leader and other members saying we have to rush this process along. We have to give the FBI just a few days in order to complete their investigation because, my goodness, we have got to fill that empty seat on the Supreme Court. Now, how hypocritical is that? Let me remind my colleagues that less than 2.5 short years ago, following the death of Justice Scalia, my Republican colleagues simply refused to even consider President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland for a seat on the Supreme Court, and they left that seat open for 10 months until they got a Republican president. So if you could wait for 10 months to fill that empty seat, I think you can wait a few weeks more for us to do a thorough investigation of the charges, the allegations against Judge Kavanaugh. Mr. President, we're dealing not only with Judge Kavanaugh's right-wing political philosophy, we are dealing here not only with the serious allegations of sexual assault, which have to be thoroughly investigated. We're dealing with another very important issue, and that is the issue of veracity. Whether or not Judge Kavanaugh was honest and truthful in terms of his responses to questions asked of him recently and years before when he came before the Judiciary Committee. And I have heard colleagues here say, I think rightfully, that regardless of philosophy, if somebody lies to a U.S. Senate committee, that person should not be seated. So what we need right now, not in a few days period, we need a thorough investigation not only of the charges, the allegations of sexual assault, but also issues of whether or not Judge Kavanaugh has been honest when he came before the Judiciary Committee. And let me give you just a few examples of what I mean that need to be explored. In his previous testimony before the committee, Judge Kavanaugh was asked more than 100 times if he knew about files stolen by Republican staffers from Judiciary Committee Democratic staff. He said he knew nothing, didn't know anything about it when he was in the Bush White House. Yet emails released as part of these hearings show that these files were regularly shared with Kavanaugh while he was on the Bush White House staff. In fact, one of the emails had the subject line, spying. Was Judge Kavanaugh telling the truth, or was he lying? We've got to determine that. In 2006, Judge Kavanaugh told Congress that he didn't know anything about the NSA warrantless wiretapping program prior to it being reported by the New York Times. This year, an email revealed that while at the White House, he might have been involved in some conversations about this program. Was Judge Kavanaugh telling the truth in his response to the committee? In 2004, Judge Kavanaugh testified that the nomination of William Pryor to the 11th Circuit Court, quote, was not one that I worked on personally, end quote, again, when he was in the Bush White House. Documents now contradict that statement. Newly released documents also call into question whether Judge Kavanaugh was truthful that the nomination of Charles Pickering, quote, was not one of the judicial nominees that I was primarily handling, end quote. Was he telling the truth? And if he was not telling the truth on these issues, does that tell us something about the character of this man who wants to take a seat on the Supreme Court? 2006, Judge Kavanaugh testified, and I quote, I was not involved and am not involved in the questions about the rules governing detention of combatants, end quote. New evidence released as part of these confirmation hearings contradicts that assertion. Additionally, now those are issues not dealing with the allegations of sexual assault. But in terms of the recent allegations, Judge Kavanaugh repeatedly told the committee that he never drank to the point of where he didn't remember something. He also denied ever becoming aggressive when he drinks. This is not an issue of whether somebody drinks or not. Millions of people drink. This is an issue of whether or not he was being honest in his responses. There have, as you know, been a number of reports from those people that Judge Kavanaugh attended high school with, attended college and law school with, that contradict his assertion about his drinking habits. Judge Kavanaugh himself, in a 2001 email, referenced growing aggressiveness during a weekend vacation, but that he didn't remember. Again, the issue here is not drinking. The issue is veracity. Was he telling the truth? On another issue, Judge Kavanaugh testified that he treated women, quote, as friends and equals, unquote, and with dignity and respect. Numerous entries in his school yearbook would seem to suggest otherwise. Was Judge Kavanaugh's statement to the committee truthful? Again, whether you like his philosophy or you don't, it is important for us to ascertain the veracity of his testimony. Judge Kavanaugh claimed that he and Dr. Ford, quote, did not travel in the same social circles, end quote. Dr. Ford said she dated Chris Garrett, referenced as a friend in his yearbook. In fact, she testified Garrett introduced her to Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh claimed numerous times in response to Dr. Ford's allegations that, quote, all four witnesses say it didn't happen, end quote, and that witnesses, quote, refuted Dr. Ford's story. Yet one of the witnesses simply said she didn't remember the party in question, took place decades ago, but that in fact she believes Dr. Ford. Kavanaugh testified that he had, quote, no connections to Yale, when in fact he was a legacy student whose grandfather attended the school. Kavanaugh also claimed that he had no idea that his mentor and good friend, Alex Kaczynski, was sexually harassing his clerks and creating a hostile work environment. But it was such Kaczynski's behavior was such an open secret that some law schools were warning potential applicants to stay away from Kaczynski. Kavanaugh claims he was not on Kaczynski's infamous email list, but refused to even search his emails to double-check. Was Judge Kavanaugh telling the truth about his relationship with Judge Kaczynski? Mr. President, these are very, very serious issues. Millions of Americans are deeply involved and concerned about these issues. Issues not only about philosophy, issues about sexual harassment of women, issues about veracity. This is a question that we have got to get to the bottom of. We do not need artificial time limitations. Let us do it right before we cast a vote on Judge Kavanaugh. And with that, I yield the floor.